It was my sophomore year of college when I first met him. The university housing department had randomly paired us as roommates in Wesley Hall, one of those older brick dormitories with squeaky floors and windows that never quite sealed properly against the winter chill. I remember walking into room 312 that August afternoon, the humidity making my t-shirt cling to my back as I lugged in the first of many boxes. He was already there, hanging up a vintage movie poster. Casablanca, I noted with interest, and turned to me with a smile that immediately put me at ease. "You must be the new roommate," he said, stepping forward to help me with my box. "I'm Daniel." His voice had a slight rasp to it, like someone who stayed up late talking with friends around campfires. I introduced myself, and we fell into that awkward but excited conversation of two strangers realizing they'll be sharing a 12 by 15-foot space for the next 9 months. Our dorm room was typical college fare: 2 twin beds with thin mattresses, 2 wooden desks that had seen decades of students come and go, and a small window that overlooked the quad. The walls were that institutional off-white that somehow managed to look both sterile and dingy at the same time. We each had a narrow closet, barely big enough for a semester's worth of clothes, and we shared a mini fridge that hummed loudly at random intervals throughout the night. Daniel was studying architecture, evident from the drafting tools and sketchbooks that soon occupied his desk. I was pursuing English literature, my side of the room quickly overflowing with dog-eared novels and poetry collections. He was tall, with dark curly hair that fell across his forehead when he was focused on his drawings. His eyes were a deep brown that crinkled at the corners when he laughed, which was often. There was something magnetic about his presence. He moved with a quiet confidence that I both admired and envied. Those first few weeks, we developed the careful choreography that roommates do, learning each other's schedules, respecting boundaries, negotiating the shared space. We weren't best friends, but we got along well. We'd occasionally grab dinner together at the dining hall or watch a movie on one of our laptops when we both had free time. It was comfortable, easy. What I didn't expect was how attuned I would become to his presence. I noticed the way he always wore mismatched socks, how he hummed under his breath when he was working on a difficult design problem, the particular way he made his bed each morning with hospital corners. I told myself this was normal, just the result of living in close quarters with someone. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it, something I wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. The Midwest autumn that year was particularly beautiful, with the campus maples turning brilliant shades of red and orange. But as October gave way to November, the charm of fall faded into the harsh reality of approaching winter. The radiators in our building clanked and groaned, struggling to keep up with the dropping temperatures. Many nights, I'd wrap myself in an extra blanket, trying to stay warm as the wind whistled through the not-quite-sealed window frame. It was during one of these cold snaps, just before Thanksgiving break, when everything changed between us. The weather forecast had predicted snow, but what we got instead was freezing rain, the kind that coats everything in a dangerous, beautiful layer of ice. I remember looking out our window that evening, watching the rain come down in sheets, freezing almost instantly on contact with the ground. We were both studying for midterms, Daniel at his desk, architectural models spread out before him, and me on my bed, surrounded by literary criticism books. The wind was howling outside, making the window rattle in its frame. I had just gotten up to make some tea on our contraband hot plate when it happened. A flash of lightning, a tremendous crack of thunder, and then darkness. Complete, absolute darkness. "Whoa." Daniel's voice came from somewhere in the blackness. "Power's out." I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam caught Daniel's face, his features sharp in the harsh light. "Campus-wide, probably," I said, moving to the window. Outside, the entire quad was dark, the usual glow of dorm windows and streetlights extinguished. Only the occasional sweep of a car's headlights illuminated the icy landscape. "Well, this is inconvenient," Daniel said, closing his textbook. I was just getting to the good part about load-bearing walls. His attempt at humor didn't quite mask the concern in his voice. Our room was already getting colder without the struggling radiator's heat. I checked my phone. The university alert says they're working on it, but with the ice storm, it could be hours. I shivered involuntarily, watching my breath form a small cloud in the beam of light. Daniel noticed. "You cold already? It's going to get worse before it gets better." He stood up, stretching. I have an idea. When I was a kid and the power went out, my family would build a fort in the living room and all huddle together for warmth. We could try something like that. The suggestion hung in the air between us. There was something intimate about it, something that crossed the careful boundaries we'd established as roommates. But practicality won out over awkwardness. That actually sounds smart, I admitted. What did you have in mind? Daniel's plan was simple but effective. We pushed our beds together in the center of the room, away from the drafty window. He had a thick down comforter his mom had insisted he bring to college, and I had my wool blanket from home. Together, they made a decent barrier against the dropping temperature. We should probably conserve our phone batteries, Daniel said, turning off his flashlight, in case this lasts a while. I nodded, though he couldn't see me, and turned mine off too. The darkness was almost complete now, with just the faintest glow from emergency lights in the hallway seeping under our door. We sat on our makeshift double bed, backs against the wall, both still fully clothed including our hoodies, an awkward foot of space between us. The temperature continued to drop, and I couldn't stop my teeth from chattering. This isn't working, Daniel said after about 20 minutes. We're both freezing, and the whole point of sharing body heat is actually sharing it. There was a pause, and I could feel him looking at me in the darkness. Look, I know it's weird, but we should get under the blankets together, just until the power comes back on. My heart did a strange little flip in my chest. Yeah, okay, I said, trying to sound casual. Makes sense. We arranged ourselves under the layers of blankets, still with some space between us, both lying stiffly on our backs like corpses in a shared coffin. But the effect was immediate. The small pocket of air around us began to warm with our combined body heat. Better, right? Daniel asked, his voice closer now in the darkness. Much, I agreed, trying to relax my rigid posture. Outside, the ice storm continued, pellets of freezing rain tapping against our window like impatient fingers. The silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable, but charged with something I couldn't quite name. It was Daniel who broke it. So, since we're stuck here in the dark with nothing else to do, tell me something I don't know about you, he said. It was such a simple request, but in that moment, in the darkness, with the storm raging outside and our bodies generating a small island of warmth, it felt significant. What followed was one of those rare, magical conversations that seemed to exist outside of normal time. We talked about our families, his parents' divorce when he was 12, my mother's battle with cancer when I was in high school. We shared childhood memories, how he broke his arm falling from a treehouse he designed himself, how I used to write stories about a family of foxes that lived in our backyard. We discussed our dreams, his desire to design sustainable housing in developing countries, my hope to teach literature to kids who thought they hated reading. As we talked, the space between us gradually disappeared. I'm not sure who moved first, but suddenly our shoulders were touching, then our sides, and finally, in a move that seemed both inevitable and surprising, Daniel's arm was around me, pulling me closer for warmth. Is this okay? He whispered, his breath warm against my ear. Yeah, I said, my voice sounding strange even to myself. It's okay. The conversation continued, but now with this new physical dimension. I could feel the rumble of his laughter in his chest when I told him about my disastrous first attempt at cooking in the dorm kitchen. I noticed how his hand on my shoulder would squeeze gently when I mentioned something difficult from my past. There was a comfort in this closeness that I hadn't expected, a sense of safety that went beyond just physical warmth. Hours passed this way, our conversation drifting from deep philosophical questions to silly hypotheticals. We played 20 questions, would you rather, and made up stories about what our fellow dorm mates were doing in the blackout. All the while, our bodies remained pressed together under the shared blankets, generating a cocoon of warmth that felt increasingly like home. Can I tell you something? Daniel asked during a lull in our conversation. The storm outside had quieted somewhat, but the room remained dark and cold beyond our blanket fortress. Of course, I said, turning my head slightly toward his voice. I've wanted to get to know you better since the day you moved in, he admitted, his voice soft. But I wasn't sure how to bridge that gap without making things weird. I mean, we live together, and if I misread the situation... He trailed off. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it. What situation might you have misread? I asked, surprised at my own boldness. There was a pause, filled only with the sound of our breathing. "The way you sometimes look at me when you think I'm not paying attention," he said finally. "The same way I look at you." Before I could respond, before I could even fully process what he was saying, there was a humming sound, and then the overhead light blazed to life, flooding the room with sudden, harsh brightness. We both blinked, momentarily blinded after hours in the darkness. The power was back on. In the abrupt illumination, our position was revealed in all its intimacy. Daniel's arm around me, my head resting against his shoulder, our legs tangled together under the blankets. For a moment, neither of us moved, caught in the unexpected spotlight like actors frozen on stage. This was the moment of truth, I realized. The practical reason for our closeness was gone. The radiator was already beginning to clank, promising returning warmth to the room. Social convention dictated that we should now separate, return to our respective sides of the room, perhaps with an awkward laugh and a comment about surviving the blackout. I started to shift away, preparing to dismantle our makeshift double bed and restore the normal order of our dorm room. But Daniel didn't move. Instead, his arm tightened slightly around my shoulders. "The power's back," I said unnecessarily, my voice sounding overly loud in the now bright room. "I noticed," Daniel replied, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "But if it's all the same to you, I'm comfortable right where I am." The implication of his words, of his continued embrace, hung in the air between us. This was no longer about practicality or survival. This was a choice, a statement, a question waiting for my response. I could have pulled away, could have made a joke to diffuse the tension, could have cited the late hour and suggested we both get some sleep in our own beds. But in that moment, with the memory of our hours of intimate conversation still fresh, with the feeling of his arm warm and solid around me, I made a different choice. "I'm comfortable too," I said, settling back against him. I reached up and turned off the overhead light, returning us to the darkness that had fostered our connection. In the newfound blackness, I felt rather than saw Daniel's smile. The days and weeks that followed that night were a gradual exploration of what had begun under those shared blankets. We didn't immediately put a label on what was happening between us. Instead, we allowed ourselves the space to discover each other in this new light. Small touches became common. A hand on a shoulder while passing behind a desk chair, fingers brushing while reaching for the same book, knees touching under the small table where we sometimes ate takeout. Our conversations, which had flowed so easily in the darkness of the power outage, continued to deepen. We stayed up late talking about everything and nothing, debating the merits of different architectural movements, discussing the themes in the novels I was studying, sharing stories from our lives before we met. Sometimes we'd push our beds together again, not out of necessity, but out of a desire to be close, to recreate that first night of connection. The dynamic in our dorm room shifted subtly. What had been a carefully negotiated shared space became something more intentional, more intimate. Daniel would bring me coffee when he knew I had a morning class. I'd leave sticky notes with quotes from whatever I was reading on his desk when I thought they'd make him smile. We developed inside jokes and shared references that no one else understood. Of course, it wasn't always smooth sailing. There were moments of uncertainty, of questioning. What would happen when the semester ended? What would our friends think? What would our families say? Were we risking our comfortable living situation for something that might not last? These questions would sometimes surface late at night, when the vulnerability of what we were building felt almost too much to bear. But then there would be moments, Daniel absent-mindedly running his fingers through my hair while we watched a movie on his laptop, or the way his eyes would find mine across the dining hall and his face would light up. That made all the uncertainty worthwhile. We were writing our own story, one that had begun with a power outage and a shared blanket, but was growing into something neither of us had anticipated when we first became roommates. I remember one evening, about a month after the blackout, when we were sitting on Daniel's bed, my back against his chest as he showed me his latest architectural project on his tablet. Outside, the first real snow of the season was falling, transforming the campus into a winter wonderland. "Do you ever think about how different things would be if the power hadn't gone out that night?" I asked, watching the snowflakes swirl in the glow of the streetlights. Daniel was quiet for a moment, his chin resting on top of my head. "I think we would have found our way here eventually," he said finally. "The blackout just accelerated things. gave us permission to cross a line we were both already thinking about crossing. I considered this, turning to look at him. So you don't think it was just circumstance? The cold, the darkness, the need for warmth. He shook his head, his eyes serious. No, those things gave us an excuse, but they didn't create what was already there. His hand found mine, fingers intertwining. When the lights came back on, I didn't move away because I didn't want to. Not because I was still cold. It was such a simple statement, but it captured everything about our journey. How what had begun as practicality had revealed something true and lasting. How sometimes it takes the darkness to see what's been in front of you all along. As winter deepened and then gradually gave way to spring, our relationship continued to evolve. We faced the usual challenges of any new couple, compounded by the unique situation of sharing a small living space. We had our disagreements about cleanliness, about study habits, about how much time to spend together versus apart. But we also had the advantage of being unable to go to bed angry, of having to work through our issues rather than retreat to separate corners. Looking back now, I can see how fortunate we were to have had that power outage, that shared blanket, that night of darkness that illuminated so much. It taught us early on the importance of communication, of vulnerability, of finding warmth in unexpected places. It showed us that sometimes the most meaningful connections come not from grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but from simple human needs, for warmth, for company, for understanding. Daniel and I shared a dorm blanket when the power went out on a freezing November night. And when the power came back on, he didn't move away. Neither did I. And in that choice, in that moment of staying rather than retreating, we began something that would warm us through many seasons to come. The dorm room with its squeaky floors and drafty windows became the setting for our beginning, but it wasn't the end of our story. As it turned out, sharing a blanket was just the first of many things we would learn to share. And I remain grateful for that ice storm, for that blackout, for that moment when the power returned and we both chose to stay exactly where we were, together in the warmth we had created. Total _char_count, 18,628.